prophet Micah. There are numbers of Micahs in the Old Testament, but this is the only one who is listed as a prophet. As you know, there are 12 so-called minor prophets. The major prophets are Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and then the smaller ones, 12 of them, are the minor prophets. And this man, Micah, is particularly interesting to me, although he's rather grim. Because of the sins of Israel and Judah, to whom he's addressing his prophecy, the sins are so bad that God is going to have to punish those people. But as you know, all the prophets have two major themes. As one commentary says so well, the prophets speak of little else than these two topics. Number one, how and why God's people may expect to be punished in a variety of disasters soon. And number two, why they may expect to be rescued and restored eventually. That's Acts 3:21. God is retaining Jesus now until the good time coming arrives, until he sends Jesus back to establish peace on earth, to put an end to all anarchy and all rebellion, and truth will prevail across the world in a way that it is not now. So we want you to understand that the scene at present is very grim. And Micah will tell us that very specifically as we begin to read his words in a moment. And here it is, the word of the Lord. When you have capital L-O-R-D, that stands for Yahweh, the proper name of God. It might be Jehovah. A certain scholar has recently discovered many cases in Old Testament manuscripts where the word Yahweh, Yod, He, Vav, He in the Hebrew letters, is actually found to be pointed. That's to say, the vowel points are added to give you the word Yehovah. But it doesn't matter how you pronounce the name of God. Why do I say that? Because in the New Testament, the Greek scriptures from Matthew to Revelation, which are given us in the internet language of the time, Greek. Greek was a language that Jesus would have known. Jesus certainly would have gone shopping and been able to speak Greek. It was the international language of the day. Jesus' mother tongue was Aramaic, which is a sister language to Hebrew. When Mary called him into lunch, she would have spoken to him in Aramaic, and Jesus used the word Abba, Father, which is Aramaic, meaning father. And Hebrew would have been the language in the synagogue where he went Sabbath by Sabbath. For the moment, then, we're concerned with this minor prophet, Micah, 7 chapters. And I warn you, this is rather grim material. This is not cheerful material until we get later in the book when the sunshine of the future hope and kingdom suddenly breaks through the clouds and everything becomes very positive and cheerful. So we'll start with, as Carlos has that on the screen, the word of the Lord. That's God's message. The word in the Bible doesn't just mean the whole of the Bible. Yes, you have the words, plural, of God in the Bible. God spoke, as we just finished learning in Hebrews. God spoke in the past and then finally spoke through his Son. He used the words of his Son. And here, the word of the Lord means the message of Jehovah, Yahweh, that came to. How did it come to him? I don't know exactly, but over a period of about 50 years, this otherwise not very well known person, Micah of Moresheth, in the days of these kings, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. And you immediately remember that those were the kings during which time Isaiah was given. So you're going to find later when we get into the middle of Micah, we're going to find this marvelous prophecy about the day coming when the nations will beat their swords into plowshares. Nobody will dare build a tank to kill somebody else. All that will be past. That's actually a repeat of what Isaiah chapter 2 says. So Micah is indeed a mini Messiah, a mini messianic figure. They're all messianic figures without being the Messiah, but he is, in fact, writing what you might call a mini Isaiah, same period of time, the 8th century BC, 700 and something. So for 50 years, this man labored to give this message, and he begins with the word Shema, which we just talked about. Listen, pay attention. So our job this Resurrection Sunday is to pay attention to what is said by these prophets, because it has a direct bearing, a direct relevance to you and your Christian life. Listen, you peoples, all of you listen, pay attention. The story of the human race, the story of human history, is that we have not listened. From Adam, who was deceived, and Eve, we didn't listen to what God said. We tend not to listen to what God says. So there's some application to you personally here. There are maybe areas of your life in which you are not carefully listening to God, and I apply that to myself, of course, also. So pay attention. Listen, earth. This is a message directed to the whole human race. O earth and everything that's in it. Nobody is accepted here. Nobody is accepted by God until they learn to listen to what God says. And then a legal idea in the next line. Let the Lord God, that's Yahweh, who is also Adonai. I want you to know the word Adonai, which means Lord, and God, which is Elohim, a single person, the one God of Israel. Let him be a witness against you. This is a legal term. God is witnessing against the world. He's witnessing against us individually if we're not listening to what he has to say. So that is Yahweh. Normally, the word Yahweh was not pronounced in Jesus' day. They didn't like to say the word Yahweh. So they substituted another Hebrew word, Adonai, which means the Lord God, about 450 times. Adonai Elohim, God, let him be a witness against you. The Lord Adonai from his holy temple. God is seen in the Bible to be living in a temple, a sacred area, not on this earth. He was represented in the temple in Israel, a physical building. He lived in a temple because his presence was there. But we don't have a temple right now in Israel. There's no physical temple that you can go to in which God is said to be living. For look, verse 3, look, lo. That word lo means asterisk, special point. Don't miss this. The Lord, that's all caps, Yahweh, Jehovah, is coming out of his place and will come down, so to speak, from heaven and tread upon the high places of the earth. This is a fiercely scary, terrifying picture, if you like, very severe. What's going to happen when God steps forth, and all of the God texts in the New Testament are referred to Jesus. That's not to say that Jesus is God, but Jesus is uniquely representing God. He's the agent of the one God. So you can transfer in your mind this to the second coming of Jesus, the day of the Lord. It's certainly the day of Yahweh, his Father, but it's equally the day of Jesus, the Messiah. What's going to happen? The mountains will melt under him. Imagine that. These are very powerful images. So you stop and you ponder, you reflect on this. You lie in bed at night thinking about, what does this mean? You wake up in the morning thinking, what does this mean? How do I explain this to other people? Because all of us have the job in some capacity of sharing the only information that is ultimately of significance to any of us. So the major sections of Micah, then, just put that back again, Carlos, what you had there is very good. The major sections of Micah, 1, 2, 3, 1, 6, 1, are introduced with Shema. So you're supposed to think of the Shema. Listen, don't miss this. Okay, So what have we got here? The mountains are going to melt. Can you imagine a mountain melting under him? And the valleys, as compared with the mountains, will burst open like wax near the fire. You have to imagine all of these images. The Bible is filled with comparisons. In order to teach you, you're supposed to think of the comparison between wax and fire. What happens when you put fire on wax? It melts. And the water's poured down a steep place. Can you imagine water just pouring down like a flood, as we recently had, the most awful flood in Louisiana? Why is this in verse 5? All this is because of transgression. What is transgression? It means you're going beyond the laws of God. The Bible is a single unified book. It says that God has a law, either the law of Moses in the Old Testament times, and under our current Christian days, it's the law of Messiah, the law of Messiah, the new covenant. The new covenant is the Torah and words of Messiah. The old covenant, under which you are not, and you are not allowed to be now because that's defunct and that's finished, the law of Messiah is the Christian words of Jesus. And because we are not listening in our time to these words of Jesus, this is the transgression of Jacob. Jacob is another word for Israel. There it is in parallel. Jacob, the sins of the house of Israel. Yes, this message is directed firstly to the ethnic people we call the Jews now, Jacob or Israel. And what is the transgression? He asked the question. Good way of teaching, by the way. You ask a question, then you answer it. The transgression of Jacob is found in Samaria. That's the word for the northern part of the Israelitish kingdom, Samaria. That's where Philip went preaching the gospel of the kingdom in Acts 8. Samaritans were not thought to be good people because they had been very much punished, as is threatened here by Micah. And then what is the high place of Judah? That's the southern kingdom. Judah, basically Judah and Benjamin, and some Levites, of course, in both sections, but this would be the southern part of the kingdom of Israel, God's people. So Judah, the southern part, and Jerusalem was its capital. Therefore, that's a good explanatory term. For that reason, I, God, am going to make Samaria a heap, a wreckage really, in the open country, a place for planting vineyards. In other words, everything's going to be ruined and wrecked, and what's left is simply just farmland. I will pour down her stones into the valley and uncover her foundations. We've got very classic examples of this in our time as they rehearse the awful events of 9/11. It's going to be a wreckage. God is angry with his people here. God has a right to be angry because they're not listening. All of her pagan images, because you're not supposed to have images of God, you're not to make a visible statue of God, that would be paganism. They'll be beaten to pieces. All her wages, the money she's earning, will be burned with fire. All of her idols, her false gods, I will lay waste. Let me pause to explain to you. How do you tell your friends that God is one person? You remind them that Abraham is said to be one person. You'll find that in Ezekiel and also in Isaiah. We won't look up the verses precisely now, but Abraham is said to be one person, both in Ezekiel and in Isaiah. Well, God in the Bible is said to be one person. That's in Galatians 3:20. God is one single person. That's what it says when it says Theos is estin, or echad, who, meaning he is one. That single one. That's not difficult. God is one person in exactly the same sense that Abraham was one single person. You'll find that in Galatians 3:20. I throw in that because many of you are having discussions with your friends on who God is. As for the wages of a prostitute, she gathered them. The wages of a prostitute, they will again be used. Prostitution, we know what that is. That's sexual activity outside of marriage. That is likened to idolatry. It's as though God is saying, this is the most disgusting thing you can do, is to create an idol. You might as well just be a prostitute. You might be a professional whoremonger indulging in sex way beyond what God permits. That's as bad as getting the wrong God. Always in the Bible, very often, a direct comparison between illicit sex and illicit worship of a foreign fake God. You don't want a fake narrative when you're talking about God. So it's doom and gloom. This chapter is not a happy thing to do, but we have to listen to what these prophets said. The doom and the gloom, we might say, of the cities of Judah. This is Micah's lament. You've heard of the book of Lamentations. They're the Lamentations of Jeremiah. He lamented, and there's a place for us as Christians to lament, to weep. I think some of us were weeping yesterday about what we saw on television. And here, Micah is so upset that he's lamenting and wailing. And so God then gives you an impression of what is it to lament and wail? I will go barefoot and naked, so to speak. It's as though I take all of my clothes off and go barefoot. I'm absolutely destitute. I, the prophet speaking here, will make lamentation like the jackals. That's a form of a fox-like, dog-like creature who howls, and mourning like the ostrich. I don't think I would know what an ostrich sounds like. But you see the parallel between spiritual truth and the things we see around us. I'm so impressed as I look at the activity in our acreage of Georgia land that we currently own. The insects and the birds and the flowers, everything cries out to us. God is the creator of all that. It's absolutely amazing. And as you watch the butterflies and the birds day by day, it's as though they're having fun. They're celebrating. Who gave them that power to celebrate? And the answer is that God was doing that, is doing it constantly. So there's no excuse at all for atheism. If you don't believe there is God, you are sadly and tragically mistaken. Look at the lamentation as it continues in verse 9. Her wound is incurable. That wound has come to Judah. That's the southern 2 tribes, 2.5 tribes, if you include Benjamin. Some other Benjamites were there too. It has reached the gate, which would be Jerusalem, the gate of my people. That's to say, Jerusalem. That's the gate to the major capital city of the southern kingdom of Judah. In verse 10, don't tell it in Gath, weep not at all in Beth Leapra, roll yourself in the dust. So it's so awful you shouldn't even speak about this terrible doom and gloom that's coming. Roll in the dust in agony. Verse 11, pass on your way, inhabitants of Shafir, in nakedness and shame, inhabitants of Zanan, do not come forth. Beth Ezel is wailing and shall remove its support from you. I note that all of those towns have meanings. They have their Hebrew words that describe despair and ruin and sadness of all sorts. So every town there mentioned. We're talking basically about the area of Gaza. That's where Micah was from. That's the southwestern tip. You've heard of the Gaza Strip. Well, Moresheth, where he was from, is a town there in the very extreme southwest portion of Judah. Verse 13, harness the steeds to the chariots, to daughter Zion. Inhabitants of Lachish, it was the beginning of sin to daughter Zion. Though that city must have been particularly idolatrous, It was the beginning of sin to daughter Zion. Zion is the true people of God in Jerusalem. Zion is another word for Jerusalem. And the children of Zion are daughters and sons of Zion. For in you were found the transgressions. That's going beyond the law. Sin is the transgression of the law throughout the Bible. But you must define what you mean by law. It's not transgression of the law of Moses that is bad today, because you're not under the law of Moses. The law of Moses is defunct and finished, so don't mix the law of Moses. But the law of Messiah, if you transgress that, you're in bad trouble. Therefore you shall give parting gifts to Moresheth Gath. That's that area in the southwest of the Gaza Strip there. The houses of Achzib shall be a deception. That word Achzib means deception. Deception, prostitution, idolatry. I will again bring a conqueror upon you. There's an enemy here. The important thing for us today is to understand that that enemy was the land of Assyria. That's in the Middle East. And what is fascinating is that in the Bible, there is promise for the future. We're talking prophecy now, an invasion of Israel by Assyria. So this was not the whole thing. That happened historically in the 8th century BC. Assyria invaded Israel and took it captive. But that's only a model or a type of forerunning, an impression of a greater invasion in the future to us by Assyria. And if you want to go and check that out, you can look at our site, Focus on the Kingdom, and you'll find an article there called The Assyrian in Messianic Prophecy. So God has a way of repeating himself. You had an Old Testament episode where Assyria invaded the country of Israel, and that's going to happen again. That's why Micah is so important for us today. The glory of Israel shall come to Adullam. All of those cities are in the southwest part of Judah. Another symbol then of distraction, lamentation, sadness, and gloom. Make yourselves bald. Cut off your hair. That's the worst thing. Your hair is a wonderful thing, life-giving thing, a good thing, especially for women. Hair is said to be her glory. For your pampered children, make yourself as bald as the eagle. Probably not an eagle literally, but a vulture of some sort which has a bald head. So you see that unless you know something about the nature and creation around you, you're not going to get a full impression of these similes, these metaphors. They have gone from you into exile. So what we've read so far then is a lamentation of Micah. Watch out, another exile is coming. And indeed, it's still coming. There's going to be a time called the Great Tribulation that lies ahead of us. It's a short, agonizing time known as the time of Jacob's trouble in Jeremiah 30:31. Terrible time. Why does God do this? Because people are so slow, so dumb, so deceived, so not paying attention to God, that the only thing God can do is to give them a shocking, terrifying event. And this is what we're seeing here.